I moved from like a head of engineering role into a CTO role earlier this year. I actually thought the roles would be fairly similar, and come to find that they actually are not. They're really, really different.
Welcome back to Tech Teams Today, the podcast where we go deep with engineering and product leaders building the future of software. I'm your host, Matt McClintock. Today's guest is Lloyd Hsu, CTO at Roofstock, where he's leading engineering, data, and IT in one of the most complex tech-forward corners of real estate. Before Roofstock, Lloyd was pivotal as head of software at Personalis, a precision medicine company he helped lead from a startup to a NASDAQ-traded entity by building its tech org and software platform from the ground up. Earlier in his career, Lloyd had significant stints at various enterprise software companies, including Tibco, Oracle, and Informatica, where he spent years scaling global teams and building mission-critical software and infrastructure across industries. Lloyd, welcome to the show.
I mean, thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm excited.
Awesome. So let's get into it. You became CTO of Roofstock after a merger with Mind, where you were VP of Engineering. What advice would you give other engineering leaders about unifying code bases, teams, and roadmaps during an acquisition or post-acquisition without losing the momentum from each respective product?
Yeah, that's a good question to kind of start things with. So, for context, Mind Management is a property technology company, and we merged with a company called Roofstock, which is now the combined entity, and that's where I am the CTO. We merged about a year ago, and in general, mergers, from an engineering and technical point of view, can be quite messy. Especially in today's world where there are so many different technologies, so many different tech stacks, so many different ways of doing things. Once you put those teams together, it's very easy to fall into a mode of, well, let's just keep things separate, because that'll be easier for everybody. And while that does actually help initially, that ultimately handicaps you in the long run in terms of really functioning as a combined tech organization or a combined engineering organization. And so you really have to be very conscious and deliberate about how you go and really combine two organizations into one. And we did that at Roofstock. We spent a good 6 months after the merger really focusing on all of our internal processes, the way we, stored our source code and code repositories, the way we aligned our sprints, the way we wrote our PRDs. And there were differences in all those things, as they would naturally be, but really focusing on how we do that before we think about what are all the great new products that we can develop as a combined organization. And getting that process right was very, very important for us.
And also, I would imagine there's like a cultural element to it of, you have two orgs coming together, they have different cultures. I imagine you guys probably looked at that during the due diligence phase of, are we both symbiotic? Will both orgs sort of complement each other after the merger, basically, right?
Yeah, it's starting to touch on culture, which is such a big aspect of success, in the working world and in the company anyway. But as part of due diligence, you do look at culture in general as good as you can. And we honestly felt that both companies had a very, very compatible culture. In fact, the culture seemed really, really similar. Now, when you get down into specific nuances, there's going to be differences there for sure in any two groups that combine together, and we were no different. So the important thing is, and this is true with a lot of things, is everyone having sort of a shared, vision of where things want to be. Like everybody wants to get to the point where we are all a very, a combined organization that is thought of as one engineering organization, and we can really do things in harmony together with each other. And that was sort of like, you first have to share that goal and that vision, and then give time to work through the specific aspects of culture, hearing the why we do it this way versus why the other team does it a different way, and really kind of hearing with an open mind, and then collectively finding an answer. Okay, going forward, how should we do it? And so if you come in, I think the advice there is like if you come in with a, well, I have a playbook, this is what always works for me. I think that is like potentially, doomed to have lots of setbacks and potentially ultimately failure. You really do have a very open mind in terms of how things are done. And I would say in our case, we had a lot of people with that sort of that attitude. That's really helped us.
Yeah, and there's also the added benefit of both engineering orgs sitting down and saying, okay, this is how we do things, this is how we do things. But ultimately, your goal is to get to the best of and leave the sort of weaknesses of both orgs behind, right? So you can sort of get the best practices from
Yeah.
both
Yeah.
orgs, combine them, and then you're sort of a powerhouse.
Yeah, and again, this does require people to be willing to listen to what has worked for another team or the rationale for why they do things the way they do, and then think about it and say, hey, maybe that's better than how we do it. And maybe it isn't. And I'll give you a like a simple example that just really doesn't feel like that big of an example, but it was an honest topic for us to debate was sprint schedules. So we use agile scrum here. Both companies use it. Great. Like we're all aligned in how we do things. But okay, then it came down to, do each of your teams try to line up your sprint at the same start and end dates, or do you let each team, choose when they want to do that? One company was very, very precise, meaning every one of our teams starts on the same day, every one of our teams finishes on the same day. And this works for us because everything's very well coordinated. People can plan properly at the start. Can people expect to have deliverables at the end? If you have multiple teams combining things together, this coordinates things. The other side was like, we just let every team do what they want. Like, why should this be prescriptive, right? Let them figure out which day is good and bad too. And there's pros and cons to doing it that way as well. And so we had, and that's really maybe not even that big of a merger point. But it is one of those small details that in the way you operate that eventually does get to become pretty important. And we were able to kind of hear both sides of that and have a number of people participate in that discussion and fairly quickly come up with a, hey, this is how we want to do it combined. And the answer we ended up going with was some sort of hybrid where on the same week you start a sprint, but not necessarily on that day, because different some days may be easy for some teams, some days may be different for others. If we have a remote team and we have a globally distributed team, and that may not work for some people. We had, some teams had a habit of demoing things on Friday afternoon when they were done, but we have teams in Europe and
Right.
Friday afternoon in the West Coast, where we're located in Oakland, California. That doesn't work. It's
Yeah.
already Friday night. It's time to
Yeah.
go have a beer and have some fun, right? And so we sort of allowed a bit of flexibility there, but also taking to the account of, hey, it's actually useful when everybody knows this week is start of sprint week, and
Right.
then 2 weeks from now is the end of the sprint. And so, finding sort of a nice combined answer that works for the new company is really, really helpful. It brings up another point around that, which is that there's a tendency to stick to, hey, we used to do things at the old company this way, and we used to do things, another way. It's very helpful to think of, hey, we're now not either the old Roofstock or the old mind. We are a new Roofstock, and
Yeah, it's
it's
like
like
you
we've all
said,
joined a new
the
company,
new company. Right. Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
And so let's have a chance to kind of think about everything we've learned and put together something that works for the new company.
So I think it's a really important topic because I think the present and future of tech is going to be a lot of M&A, and a lot of aggregation. So that's why I'm sort of double clicking into this topic, because if you're an engineering leader and you haven't been through an acquisition or a merger yet, more than likely you will experience that in the coming years. I would just go into sort of digging a little deeper. Is what's one assumption you had going into the merger that
Mm.
completely changed once you took on the CTO role? So post merger.
Um, Yeah, yeah. Some of this reflects on some of the points that I was making before, but I think, I think I had an assumption going in that there was sort of a preferred way to do things that people were going to sort of stand hard on and say, we always use GitHub or we always use GitLab, and that's just works for us, or we use Bitbucket or whatever it may be.
Right.
And I thought that was going to be something that was going to require a lot of sort of discussion, debate, and and really sort of trying to win hearts and minds over to doing those things. Come to find out, a lot of these things, it is not technical in terms of why you choose one or the other. I mean, obviously, sometimes there is, but a lot of times it is a lot of personal, sort of, wants for things. And I think those things can be, when there is a larger goal in mind, those things don't mean as much. And I think our team members and our engineering, all the different engineering folk on both sides really wanted to embrace sort of a new world. And it's like, great, I spent all my time, writing all this like automation for GitLab, but I actually see there's benefits in GitHub. I don't mind switching to that and using that. And we saw that come like play out over and over and over again. And it was very, very beneficial for us. I think in some ways that speaks to the culture, and it speaks to just kind of like, kind of thinking about things in what really matters.
Right. It's compromise on both sides, and you have to keep an open mind, right? Just because you're
Absolutely.
used to using a particular tool or technology stack doesn't mean that you shouldn't evaluate or consider trying something new.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people can relate to that.
Now, I think I say that too, and at the same time, you also have to. All these things, require a little bit of judgment, that's based on experience and sort of wisdom of just doing this in the past. Not everything can be changed. Some things
Right.
are better just left alone for now because maybe it really is too time consuming or costly or disruptive to make that change. Maybe in the future we might still, and so it's important to recognize that, and maybe a certain way a team operates is radically different, but it's effective and it just happens to work for that team. And so it is touches, it does get to some of my philosophy about just, you have a framework for how you want to do things, but a lot of times it comes down to how the people really use that framework and thrive with it. And it may be different frameworks, it may be different processes, but it sort of really depends on what works for the team and what works for the people.
And pulling back a little bit from the M&A side, you build engineering orgs across proptech, biotech, SaaS, and deep tech. What's a pattern that you found stayed consistent across industries and delivery models? And sort of where does
Yeah.
that pattern break down, maybe?
Yeah, yeah. So, a common theme, there are several common themes, and so happy to kind of lay them out and then see where you want to like kind of go in on it. But one thing is in terms of like everybody is trying to use technology to simplify what they do, and whatever that is that they do, right? And so we've had biotech company. I worked for a biotech startup, Personalis, which was trying to use genomics to develop cancer diagnostic tests. There's so much nuance in how you do that test. There's so much nuance in how you run the lab for each sample that comes in with a patient that you could do that by hand with lab technicians, and it would just take so long for everyone, and it would be complex, and it would be error prone, and you'd have to have high level experts. People are using technology to simplify that, to repeat it, to scale it so that you're getting the best knowledge and you're encapsulating it somehow in your technology so that that can be applied in a mass broad sense. Now I'm in Roofstock, which is like focusing on using technology to really power rental housing in the rental housing ecosystem. It's actually fairly similar. You just substitute RNA and DNA for repairs and maintenance. You substitute like a patient portal or a clinical portal on your mobile app for a resident portal on your mobile app, for tenants. The needs are still the same. How do I do things that typically would take a long time without technology, and suddenly with technology it gets easier? These are the patterns that I see across many startups, many companies, all trying to use technology to make a better life, to make a bigger impact, to help them scale. They're all different domains, but it's very, very common, the technologies that are getting built.
But those are two pretty mission critical domains, housing and health, right? So you have to be super careful about how you approach that from a technology perspective.
That's true.
What's your framework for navigating trade-offs between speed, scale, and security in a sector like, let's say, real estate that touches regulation, money, and human livelihoods?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, I think the important part of this is that, in any sort of industry like that where you're using technology in a domain that's not pure tech, let's just say, and I do think there are more and more companies now that are trying to do things like that, right? It is about people, process, and technology, right? And all three of those things being applied into the solutions and the products and the services that you're offering to help make that happen. So, on the technology side, it's maybe not that different from what other people have had experience when, when you're building out a new product and you need to test it out if it's actually going to get adoption, whether you found the right fit and whether maybe potentially want to come out before a competitor comes out. The speed part takes top precedence there, right? And maybe the other stuff is not as much. Now, we do find technically, security can be implemented very, very early on. And so, we put in security methods into our product. We build with best security practices into our product, even when it's small, because the technologies are so readily available today. The techniques are so readily available. That might have been harder maybe 20 years ago, but it's so commonplace now that you can build that in. The scale part comes after you really do get adoption. It is very easy for companies to over engineer that part. And so you don't want to build something that's more than, say, 3 years out. You figure you're doing a major rewrite of your software every 3 to 5 years, typically, sometimes maybe faster, but a lot of companies typically around that time. So you need to build for some scale for that time frame, and you need to invest engineering resources and time and bandwidth into that. But if you go beyond that, you're reaching the point where you're over engineering, and this is where a lot of I've seen a lot of orgs sort of make that wrong assessment and ultimately spend a lot of time when they didn't really need to.
Yeah, it goes back to my first CTO used to always tell us, when we're built to scale, then we'll scale. You don't
Yes.
start with scaling, right? First, you got to build out that infrastructure, and that can take time. You have to be willing to make that
Yeah.
investment.
Yeah.
So from
Yeah.
staying in on this topic, sort of what's a technical or security
Yeah.
investment that felt like a cost center at first, but actually turned out to be a pretty significant strategic advantage?
Yeah, I think, the interesting thing is how, like, having worked at larger companies and sort of products that have had like really, large adoption, I've sort of taken this view over time that I don't really think of things as cost centers. They always have value at some point, and it's really just a sort of a, when do you introduce it into your product, but I would say some things that we have done maybe earlier than I would have on my own. And this is where, like, you do want to rely on more than just you to make those decisions, right? This is where it comes down a little bit to engineering leadership. When your team is telling you certain things, and have certain ideas about why it would be good, you do have to listen to that and think about that. And so for us, it was putting in, something like observability tools, like a Datadog, into the product, paying for that, and that those licenses aren't cheap.
No,
and,
they're
and
not.
and paying for that maybe before we had the right, customer level adoption, or, the demands on it. It was, the last time we did that, it was probably earlier than what I would have typically prescribed, but, the team very much wanted to do that. And we derived tremendous benefit from it. And it really helped us figure out, problems in our infrastructure. It helped us figure out, even record different events that were happening and see how usage was happening. It's not as, full featured as maybe some of those products like, full story and amplitude and heat art in terms of plugging product, but you can actually tell a little bit of that already. And so we derived all sorts of additional metrics and values from those things, which I think that did help us advance our product faster. And it was a little bit to my surprise. And I think there's a lesson in there too, in general. It's just like, it's very hard to know, like, you should not expect to know everything. You should not expect to have all the right answers. You, the individual, you do need to leverage all the experts out there and all the engineers who know something, and who really kind of thinking about that problem maybe more than you are, and be able to listen to all that and take all that input, and help make a decision. And this is an example where that was like the case.
Yeah, because as an engineering leader, to a degree, you kind of have to be somewhat of a generalist, and underneath you have a lot of specialists, and you sort of need to lean on them for a little bit of guidance in terms of strategy. So, on that point, sort of, what's a security or infrastructure blind spot that you've seen in startups, particularly startups that are scaling? And I've noticed
Mm,
this inflection point of sort of, once you go over like 50 engineers, you
yeah.
know, that's really seems to be like the tipping point.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think up to 50 engineers. You can lead an organization a certain way. Everyone tends to, you typically are optimizing for a lot of speed of features. The culture is a little bit more sort of well understood implicitly about how you want to do it. Definitely beyond 50, and we're an organization that's more like 150 right now. You start to become that tends to get lost through all the teams. You really do have to have good structure and good, sort of communication about how things should be done. But one blind spot that we've seen is that this aspect of figuring out what sort of security vulnerabilities you have in your software, and there are a lot of tools to help you figure out vulnerabilities. When you're sort of a small engineering team, engineers are probably pulling in many things from open source, many different tools, many different frameworks, and you want that. You want all of that very fast, frenetic energy. Just pull things in, get things built, get things going, and each engineer will do that, and they won't all think the same. They will pull different things. Over time, that starts to proliferate. When you do a vulnerability check on your security, that will show up as a lot of vulnerabilities, and then you might look at that time and go, ooh, we maybe need to consolidate some of these. This one has a really, like a license that's very good. This one is a little bit risky, and this is patched very often. This one's not patched very often, and so the blind spot is sort of not recognizing as you reach to a certain point, you really do need to have more concerted efforts around aligning on which tools we bring into our product stack. And that way, when we do things like security checks and vulnerabilities and things, it's a manageable number versus something that just sort of got away from you and it's all over the place. The other blind spot is potentially just ignoring what those things say, and just go, whatever, like we don't need to worry about that. We got to focus on our priorities and we got to build, right? But, in our experience, those things don't take a lot of time to build or to fix. And it's time well spent. It just creates less headaches later on when you really worry about it, when legal gets involved and,
Right.
your formal IT department gets involved and things like that. And it's sort of become unmanageable. Oh, we got to take 2 full sprints to resolve that or something. At that point, it's like, yeah, you can nip a lot of things in the bud when you sort of see them first arise.
Yeah, you deal with them earlier when they're manageable, right?
Yeah.
Because if they're at
Yeah.
scale, it's so much harder. I
And
want
I
to,
feel like that's a commentary like on tech debt and everything too, right? It's just
right.
like if you think
Yeah.
things on the spot, it might be a lot easier than just letting it wait and nobody remembers the code.
Yeah, we had a guest actually equate tech debt with swiping the credit card of your team's,
Yes.
future, basically, which was a pretty interesting analogy. So I want to pivot a little bit to what everybody's talking about. I feel like you can't have a conversation with an engineering leader today without talking about AI. So
Yeah.
let's cover that. So there's obviously a ton of hype around AI. That's probably an understatement, especially in product-led companies. What's your sort of current lens on applying AI within a product today?
Yeah, so I mean, absolutely AI is in the forefront of everybody's conversation, and our company is like no different. We're talking about AI all the time and thinking about how to take advantage of it, honestly. All right. And so it's a variety of different ways. Like we're talking about it in terms of internal productivity, both in terms of engineering as also non-engineering. We have a lot of positions in our company that are non-engineering. And AI tools can help with that. And so one thing that I've seen is that more than any other technology, like people are gravitating towards it very quickly. In some ways, you don't like think that they've been using it, and you start talking with them, and they're like, oh, I do use it very frequently, and so that's important. Now, that's more the non-engineering side. On the engineering side, we're also looking a lot very closely at how we can use agentic IDEs and all those productivity tools for engineering. Engineers, one, we're trying to sort of make it frictionless to go ahead and use that. So whether there be like just in terms of a simple thing like reimbursing, for using those tools, but then two, encouraging people to explore and experiment. And so a lot of these things, it's some ways it's a cultural aspect too, meaning like I don't want to put like a mandate. Like you hear about some companies putting
Right.
mandates saying like everybody must use AI from this point on and things like that. I feel like those top-down mandates don't. really, get the effect that was intended. And they don't really get that grassroots sort of exploration and adoption. So I look for situations where it can really, I just talk about it, talk about it a lot, bring up a lot of things. Hey, I'm trying out Cursor and Windsurf on my own right now. And I'm trying to build some personal apps, and I'm getting some learning experience with it. And I make it a point to kind of share with people, on Slack and other things like, hey, try out these tools, because I do think that with AI tools, you do have to use it just to see
Yeah.
what's capable and not capable. It's like it doesn't just work exactly the way people say, and you do have to just become familiar with it to learn how to do that. So we're encouraging our developers to do that, and a lot of them are trying to work with the agents and work with the code bases. Sometimes the agents do way too much, and so we're getting some of that feedback. We're getting a lot of feedback from our engineers that it's very hard to just use it purely on your own and sort of use it on, say, code you don't know. Like I want to code in a language that I'm just not familiar with. Like that's kind of fraught with danger at the moment. It's better to do it on code that you're very familiar with, or like a language that you're very familiar with, because you can see the suggestions that it's asking you. You can say, hey, I'm looking to put changes into 5 source code files. Like I like 2 of them being changed. I don't like the other 3. And you can make that qualification as an engineer and seeing what that is. And so you're saying, okay, it does actually help me in a number of cases, but then I know it's kind of like a little too eager, and I know when to pull it back. And I think that's where the state of like a lot of these coding tools are in practice right now. It's very powerful, but if you sort of let it run, it may do more than you want it to do. And so you need to have engineering expertise as a software developer to kind of know what exactly do you want out of it. And so we're seeing that with our internal productivity tools. And then the last part is just we are working into all of our products how to build AI types of features, right? How to build, productivity features, summarization features, scanning of handwritten documents in real estate. There are a ton of handwritten documents. We can scan those in with AI, save people a lot of time. People before, operations teams before, was looking at those handwritten documents and transposing them. And we built sort of all sorts of fancy UIs to help them transpose easily. We're also, don't need to do some of those things anymore. So we're really revamping a lot of our products to take advantage of that. So I covered a lot of stuff there. I don't know if there's a specific point you
Well,
want to double click on there.
Well, there's always two sides of it. There's how is your engineering team using AI essentially to build products and write code? And then there's how is your product using AI? And so you sort of hit on both points. So I also think it's interesting that you don't, like a lot of companies do have those mandates, and they're more specific than just you have to use AI. Everybody has to use Cursor or Windsurf or GitHub Copilot, like specifically. And the measurement of AI is something I find really interesting. Does your team, do you have sort of a mechanism for measuring for the engineers on your team that are using AI? Are you measuring sort of adoption, or let's say they start using Cursor on day 1, they tell you, do you check in on day 90 and see if they're still using it?
Yeah, we've, actually it's very interesting because we've always had a very globally distributed team at these companies. And so, we found it really important to develop a lot of engineering metrics on, just general teams productivity and things like that, and just ways not for us to surface that to the executives or to the board and say, guess what, we're doing this many, stories per sprint or whatever, but more for us as managers just to kind of know is anything sort of off the tracks that we need to look into. I ultimately think those can be, applied to, teams using those tools and just kind of saying how more productive are they, and things like that. But we're actually not trying to do that right now because there's a level of freedom I feel like it's really important to give engineers right now when you use these tools. Otherwise, I feel like you'll start to look at these tools as, oh, like there's a lot of demands expected of me, and is this a tool I want to use? I don't trust this tool, so I'm not going to. For the first time, I'm getting trouble. Like it can't debug something for me. Like I'm just going to give up because I can't afford to waste time. Like I don't want that type of behavior right now until people are really, really familiar with how to use it. So we're kind of like maybe holding back on that just a bit to really let people take chances and take risks. I think that's really important for, at least for us, we haven't been using it maybe as much as maybe other companies have. And so we've really been getting started in like the last month or so. And so I feel like you kind of have to let people try things out for a while.
Yeah, everybody's sort of at a different phase of AI adoption. It's rare that I'll speak to two engineering leaders that are at the exact same phase of adoption. To move on from the AI topic, because as you know, I think it's talked about quite a bit and quite enough. So I don't want to go too much into it. But let's talk about sort of org design and engineering culture. So you've scaled engineering orgs across time zones and different stages. You actually scaled a company from a startup to a publicly traded company. That's a huge deal, and obviously, congratulations on that. In your experience, what are sort of the key ingredients to making distributed teams work, and maybe some things to avoid when managing distributed teams?
Yeah, yeah, like very, very interesting topics for sure. And then this is one of the things where like things change over time, and so we started, and this is true of so many different things. We could probably talk about a lot of things where things change, right? But here's a good example of how to manage remote teams. It changed over time. We first started doing this back at Tipco Software, I want to say in the early 2000s after the dot-com bust, and people started saying Bay Area engineers are too expensive. We need to go to India. And then later on, it was like, we need to go to China. India's getting too expensive, and things like that. And the way you manage remote teams then is so different than the way you do it now. And then it was sort of like, you don't have like this sort of technology around Zoom and things like that, and all these sort of asynchronous tools. So it's like, we need to have centers of excellence. We need to have, a independent team there. We need to make lots of visits there, fly out there every month, every 2 months, like make sure there's lots of interaction. There are like phone calls late at night, all sorts of things like that, right? Today, the world has changed quite a bit. Very, very different, right? And processes were developed around those to make those good. Some of them are valuable and still remain today. A lot of times one good thing is your process of documentation, and the need for it, right? And I think when a lot of teams are just based in one location, say like in your startup and everyone's based in the same location, it's like, documentation, whatever, we can do that another time. There's no time, right? And people don't like doing documentation anyway. But with remote teams, it becomes incredibly important. And it's not just the documentation of the product you're doing, but it's the decision making that you're doing, the technical decision making. And you want to have these documents out there. And so we've done this over the years, whether it be way back in the Tipco days or even today in Roofstock, where we've got engineers all over Eastern Europe. We've got engineers in Latin America, Pakistan, all sorts of different countries. Having like a framework for when we want to make a technical decision that maybe spans more than one team, putting a document out there, saying the considerations, letting people weigh on it in their time zone and contribute that way to that document, put in comments, put in questions, then have the other team respond to it or the other engineer respond to it back and forth and communicate through that way. That is much more of a, I don't know, in some ways it's more of a comfortable way to communicate these days anyway, in general. All the stuff through texting and chatting and things, it's like that really works for getting teams to coordinate remotely. And we don't really have remote teams where there's like actually like a center where there's like 20 engineers in like one office. They really are spread out like all over the place. But we've been able to make that work with all sorts of, communication techniques, shared documents. Then maybe the biggest point is around having a culture and setting up a culture, for your organization that everyone, buys into, understands, and practices on a daily basis. This helps tremendously, whether you're talking about a local team or whether you're talking about a distributed team, right? And so if you like, I don't know if you want to talk about culture a bit more, but I think this has been always a key ingredient for any good organization that I've had or been a part of. The culture was very strong, and people believed it and felt it added value, and people knew what to do, even when their managers weren't talking about this is what you should do. That
Right.
culture could sort of help them.
Yeah, I feel like with distributed teams, culture becomes so much more important. It's,
Oh yeah.
even managing engineers in the early 2010s. I remember managing multiple engineers where I never even spoke to them on the phone. It was just code reviews. We would have code reviews as long as they were committing and the quality code and everything was working, that was fine. There weren't all these tools and technologies today. I think the most that we could see was like work diary, where it would take like a screenshot of what they were working on like every 5 minutes. And like
Yeah.
beyond that, like there really wasn't much communication.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I do see communication like today anyway. I think people have started to become better. Like I'm not just talking about engineering leaders, but individual contributors and engineers themselves. Everyone's starting to sort of understand how to work in a distributed setting and I do think communication in whatever form is a big part of it. And so what I'll see doing is I will see when they're debugging an issue and it's like people in different time zones and they're working on something, they'll be writing their thoughts down like on Slack or whatever. And so it's like you're thinking out loud and you're writing it down. And that really, really helps the other person potentially try to assist you or try to at least know where you're coming from. And I see people just doing that very naturally. And I think there's all sorts of examples of that now where people feel a need. I still think, even though remote is so commonplace today, there's still a need to be connected with people. And
For
they're
sure.
connected with your colleagues, connected with your peers. And people have really sort of, in some ways, they've innovated different ways to do that. And they've gotten used to different ways to do that. I think if you tried this back in the early 2000s, they would say that's not enough. Like we need to visit. Like we need to come to the US. You guys need to come here. We need to actually see each other face to face, right? That used to be sort of
Yeah.
like that used to be like the formula of every how do you manage a distributed team? You must have as much on-person visits as possible.
Right.
That's still valuable today, but people have also learned, especially in times where the economics are not really good and sometimes everyone's budgets are shrinking in terms of travel and things like that right now. People have learned to adapt and figure
Yeah.
out, well, how can we also get that camaraderie even if we're not seeing each other in person?
Yeah, I think one thing I've heard quite a bit is like whether they're remote or not remote or hybrid, treat all your engineers the same.
That's
And
true.
yeah, and you'll see sort of the best result there.
Yeah, this is one of those things. A good example of that is like don't use the whiteboard. Like we do have people in our headquarters in Oakland. We do have people in the office, and sometimes we're on hybrid calls. And we will have people in a conference room in those situations. But everybody inherently knows, and we didn't even have to say this as a policy. People just understand that it's not good to write things on a whiteboard and start drawing things up. People aren't going to be able to participate. I think a lot of people know how to do that well now, but where it's not, that's where you need to step in and kind of really kind of put in a good cultural practice. But I find people are very adept at working, across time zones today.
So going into leadership philosophy a little bit more. So you've held multiple top engineering roles. When you reflect on leadership, what signal tells you that you're doing your job well?
Yeah, I think there are several signals for sure. Some of it is from a company indication point of view, how well ultimately we're all here to try to make, whatever, company we are, working for, we're trying to make that company successful. And so is that actually happening? And are you getting the success metrics that you're hoping to get, whether it be, growing in revenue, growing in profits, gaining users, whatever that is. So is that happening? Because you do have to be cognizant of that as a technology organization, right? You can't just be building technology for technology's sake. It has to matter, and it has to make a difference. That's really important. But I also look at a lot of internal signals too, in terms of like are not so. I do look at whether people feel happy and people feel like the morale is good and things like that. But I'm also look at things about are people developing and growing when they're here? And am I creating an environment that lets people sort of succeed where they want to, whether they, to further their careers where they want to? That's really, really an important thing for me. Like, and I always look at it that, it's sort of a two-way street when you work with your team. Like you want them believing in the mission of the company and contributing greatly to that mission, but they should also be individually getting something out of that too. And they should be learning and developing their careers. And it does give me a lot of pride when I look back on various people that have worked with me in organizations and see them after they've left or after I've left, see them progress, to a higher level or to a greater charter or whatever they're doing. I'd like to think that I was part of that, in their journey in terms of helping them. And then,
Yeah,
so yeah.
and sometimes that's a lagging indicator, and you're not going to know that until years after you manage them, right? Like,
That's right. Yeah.
yeah.
Something that I do sort of like tell, my managers and things when I'm talking to them about just sort of establishing a culture is that your relationship with your engineers, like you should think of it as it goes beyond just when you're in this company together. Like relationships with people that you work with go way beyond that time that you're actually working in that one company. It goes beyond that. It goes like, potentially even when you're not working together, you're talking and you're staying in touch. Maybe you're working together again in another venture. That's happened to me multiple times. Or maybe it becomes like a partnership thing where they sort of leading something, you're leading something in your company and you guys are doing something together. Like these things there's so many times where this happens, that it's really important to think of it in a very long-term relationship and build that trust, build that back and forth, build that guidance, build that learning from them too. And I think operating with those values really create like a very, very good environment for everyone to be, thriving in. And in some ways, you get a lot of positive signals that you're actually doing a good job, like when you're doing that, because everybody wants to do their best work, right? And so when you sort of make it sort of like, this is what I want to be doing, then you're going to get something good out of it. So
Yeah. So thinking about your engineers in terms of their long-term career goals and long-term career success rather than what can I get out of you in your role
yeah.
here, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right. And it's not just the long-term goals. I will ask that at times, and they'll say, I want to be a CTO one day. And okay, good. Let's spend a few minutes. Let me talk about how you might be able to get there. But sometimes it's more like just what do I want in the next year or two for myself? Even that is like really important. And it could be like I was working on this back-end module right now. I'd really want to work on something that's a little bit more full stack. And so you start to you have to, it's very important to understand what people want to, how people want to stretch themselves, how people want to develop their careers, whether it be in different domains or whatever. And then when the opportunity comes up, you know how to align it perfectly with what they want for themselves. And it's sort of a win-win for everybody when that happens.
Yeah.
Right.
I like it. So wrapping up, I got a few questions here. So I guess we'll call this a lightning round. What's something you believed as an engineering leader a year ago that you've since completely reversed your stand on?
Yeah, let's see. People would not be able to give up something that they spent a lot of time in. I kind of, for whatever reason, I've always sort of seen examples of that, and I figured that was the case, and that wasn't the case this year. People were willing to kind of say, "Hey, something better is coming. A different technology is now available. I'm going to move to that."
Yeah.
That's been very refreshing for me to see because I have seen the opposite behavior for many many a year.
Right. But that's such a critical trait of a successful engineer or even engineering leader in this
Yeah,
AI revolution of willing to compromise, willing to try new technologies, willing to abandon the things they're comfortable with and try totally new things.
yeah,
And sort of that
absolutely.
adaptability. And if you could give every new CTO, this one's interesting. If you could give every new CTO one dashboard widget to monitor daily, what would it be and why?
Hmm. Yeah. Like so I find the interesting thing is I find that when I moved from like a head of engineering role into a CTO role earlier this year, I actually thought the roles would be fairly similar and come to find that they actually are not. They're really, really different. As CTO now, I find myself needing to be much more aware of what everybody is doing in the industry, different trends that are emerging, different technologies that are emerging, different ideas that are taking hold. I didn't worry about that as much as head of engineering. I was more focused on how our team is operating, and the quality of our product and things like that. And so, yeah, a widget that I would sort of want is sort of like I don't know if it exists today, but who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it does. It's just sort of like it's like a little thing, an indicator of what's happening in the world that you need to be aware of. And maybe
Right.
that's possible with AI now. I just tell you, like Lloyd, this is what's happening today. You need to know this. But I'm finding myself as CTO like actively searching for those things all the time now, and thinking about how that eventually applies to what we're doing. It's a new
I mean,
requirement.
that's a great answer though, because I feel like the news cycles in tech are like 100x what they used to be, where it's like every day there's like hundred, not maybe not hundreds, but dozens of major new announcements where you're like, wow, we have to make a little pivot here, or we have to evaluate that tool or technology, and
Yeah,
so yeah,
there
having something where you can sort of look at that in a little summary every day.
you can definitely fall into a trap of I know what's right. I don't need to look. And then we're just
Right.
going to keep doing it. And to you, it might just look fine. But everyone else might be finding a much better way to do things, and you just would be oblivious to it, and it would come back to bite you at some point.
All right. So last question. What are you personally learning right now that's pushing you out of your comfort zone, even after over 25 years in tech?
Yeah, yeah. No, and like this is something that like I feel like good for engineering leaders always to do is to, try to have some amount of technical hands-on and technical like sort of ability for as long as you can, just a little bit, because it's really what differentiates, the roles we lead and the roles we play versus any other executive roles in other parts of the company. And so for me, I try to do that every now and then and really kind of stay up on technology. And a lot of times it's really easy to do. It's actually you recognize everything that's there. There's so much things that are very similar. It's so similar to what you've seen before that you just need to read it for a little bit and it's like, okay, thank you. That was good enough, right? Okay. But what's put me out of this comfort zone, which is probably not surprising too, because it's so much in the news, is using these agentic IDEs. So I tried with Cursor first. I kind of ran into some problems. Then I tried Windsurf. I definitely got a lot more success with Windsurf, but I mean, I think this is going to be a similar experience for any of these, anyone looking at that way of, developing applications and sort of like using what those tools have has been like very different than what I used to do when I write code and sort of figuring out how to make it do what you want and how to generate code that you're interested in and fixing the exact things you want. That's been kind of like a very refreshing thing for me to kind of experience again. And sort of like turning all the different ways that I maybe thought that I could write code and write code well. I do these things well. And then to have like an AI tool kind of do exactly what you thought you did well and have them do that is making me go, oh, I need to recalibrate my thinking. And so it is pushing me out of my comfort zone. And I will say the other part of it is honestly, is that like a lot of times when I look at applications and I look at a new application, I can already like my mind already starts thinking about how would I build this? How would I build this application? And I can figure out. I can usually kind of think about this is how I would do it if I had to do it, et cetera. It's actually usually pretty easy to figure out. I think honestly these things I actually don't know. I don't know how I would build it themselves. If I had to build a cursor, I wouldn't know how to do it.
Right.
And that makes me uncomfortable a little bit. It's like, oh my God, it's like the tech world advancing beyond sort of, what I'm capable of doing, very much so. It's like, yikes, what does that mean for me?
Maybe not the tech world as a whole, but AI, LLM
Yeah.
specifically. Lloyd, thanks so much for coming on the show and bringing, real insights on scaling, infrastructure, and engineering leadership in high complexity environments. Really appreciate it. If you found this episode valuable, hit subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. Helps other engineering leaders find the show. And if you're looking to connect with engineering leaders, check out our exclusive community, the T3 Exchange, the Tech Teams Today Exchange, link in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.